We ask the questions. What is needed in the world? Is that going
to be? June 19, Wikileaks founder Julian Assange enters the Ecuadorian embassy in London seeking political asylum, claiming an extradition order to Sweden to answer charges of sexual misconduct is a setup so that he can be sent to the United States to be tried for leaking national security secrets. Overnight, the South American country, known mostly for its rainforest, exotic animals, and bananas, becomes embroiled in a high-stakes controversy involving not just Assange, but the United Kingdom, Sweden, and the United States. When the British Foreign Ministry threatens to revoke the Ecuadorian embassy's diplomatic status to allow police to enter and arrest Assange, Ecuador's fiery leftist president, Rafael Correa, responds by granting the whistleblower asylum.
We talked to them for 2 months and their final response was a threat. We hope they withdraw it, but when you're under a threat, you can't sit down and talk.
London refuses to grant Assange safe passage. Leading the charge for Ecuador is Foreign Minister Ricardo Patino, who makes no apologies for his small country's involvement in the high-profile Assange affair, or for the battle his government is waging against Ecuador's opposition media. We went to see the foreign minister to find out why Ecuador is willing to confront far more powerful nations to defend a man who advocates unlimited freedom of expression. Foreign Minister Ricardo Patino, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. I'd like to start by asking you why. Why has a country like Ecuador decided to offer asylum to a man like Julian Assange, who, by your own admission, at least in the past, leaks information that Ecuador thought should be kept secret?
Julian Assange asked for Ecuador's protection because he feels threatened. He feels persecuted for his political opinions and for justly exercising freedom of expression. And he's afraid that as a consequence of this persecution, he could be condemned in the United States to life in prison or to the death penalty. We in our country, in Ecuador, believe in freedom of expression. In this country, we don't accept the death penalty or life in prison. We believe that any person, any delinquent, and we're not saying that Assange may be one, should be granted the opportunity, the right to be redeemed. That's why we don't believe in the death penalty. We believe in life and freedom of expression. These are the principal reasons why we finally decided to offer asylum to Mr. Assange.
Yes, but certainly Julian Assange did not pick Ecuador at random, and when he showed up at the door of your embassy at 10 o'clock at night, there was someone there waiting to open the door for him.
Mr. Assange arrived at our embassy and was received by one of our representatives following a phone call which I understand he made. I don't know all the details, but he called the embassy and Mr. Assange arrived and requested asylum.
But surely you already knew this way in advance. There were conversations.
No, we didn't have any previous conversations.
No? That's very hard to believe. I know that your deputy foreign minister at one point had even suggested that Ecuador might be willing to offer him asylum weeks or months before it actually happened.
Certainly that's something the deputy foreign minister said a long time ago, and he said it without consulting me or the president. That's why we clarified that it wasn't Ecuador's position. The deputy foreign minister said that when the first US government cables were revealed. But our government made no offer at the time.
But let's be frank, what does Ecuador have to gain from this, both domestically and internationally? There are elections in 6 months here. Why are you doing this?
A lot of people think it's strange that a government could act on principles. But we act on principles. We don't adapt to circumstances. We are not opportunists. We believe in principles, and I'm telling you, this is something I had to discuss with the president many times on issues that sometimes are not politically convenient. and other times they may be advantageous. President Correa is someone who acts on principle. He's not calculating if this is happening 6 months before the elections, or 1 month, or 3 years before. The principle by which we have to protect a person who's being persecuted for his political opinions, to protect people's right to life, has no time frame. We are not looking at the time frame. The only thing that I must tell you we did consider when we were deciding on the asylum for Mr. Assange was to think about the United Kingdom. And that's why it hurt us so much when the UK sent us such a threatening letter against our country, threatening to violently attack our diplomatic office in London, especially since we were taking them into consideration. From the start, we had a dialogue with them about the entire process. Then the Olympic Games began. We thought we wouldn't ruin the Games and we wouldn't create any uncomfortable situation by offering the asylum just then. We knew this could create an uncomfortable situation for them. We were cordial enough and decent enough to tell them in advance not to worry, that we were not going to make any announcement before the end of the Games. That's the only time we did make a calculation, but not for our benefit.
You talk about principles. That's very interesting, because your record does not suggest that Ecuador is a big defender of the limited free expression or freedom of expression. On the contrary, your president constantly attacks, every week in fact, in his national addresses, the independent or the private media. He says that there is a battle going on with them. And in fact, just very recently, the Committee to Protect Journalists issued a very, very critical report. So some would say that this is hypocritical, or at least very paradoxical.
Every word you've said is absolutely false. Absolutely false. You have the wrong information. Where are you getting it from? From the owners of the media.
No, I listen to what the president says on television every week.
Well, if you listen, then you'll know that the president does not attack the media as you just said. It's a phenomenal error on your part. The president is not attacking the media. He is revealing the media's lies. He's revealing the information they hide, the information they don't verify. Furthermore, as you know, he has a TV show every week which has a section called Freedom of Expression. And what we do, he and I, is reveal all the distorted or false information that they present every day. The media published some statement from me in quotation marks that were things I never said, issues I had never addressed. So all we do is confront the lies. This is our responsibility, because we can't let the Ecuadorian society receive false information all the time. It's time to reveal the lies of the media.
I understand that you may want to refute what you consider to be lies, or what may be lies or misinformation. But why is it that, for example, your government has ordered that no minister, such as yourself, can even give an interview to the private media, only to the public media?
This is another falsehood. I appear on the private media every day.
Do you give them your one-on-one interviews like we're having now?
No, I'm not doing that now because we reached the last straw. It can't be that we are so obliging and polite to these media groups and we are offering interviews all the time and we are helping them run their businesses because they are businesses and we treat them kindly while they are just slandering us. They just lie about any information we pass them and they turned into political activists. They are businesses that turned into political actors. If they want to find information, they should look for it. We talk to the public media and to those companies that have not turned into political activists. Those who are political actors can find their own way of doing things, but they are not real media. They are profit-making businesses that act like political actors. Some of them, and it's really just a few, 5 or 7, have turned into political actors against the government. So we can't be helping those who turned into our political enemies. We can't make their work easier. They can go to press conferences and get the interviews that they can. They can go to all the press conferences. We don't impede freedom of expression. This is very important, and it's fundamental to repeat it. We believe in a true freedom of expression. We promote freedom of expression. We think communities, social organizations, universities, and municipalities all have the right to inform, and not only 4 or 5 or 7 networks who hold an oligopoly of the information.
Well, I can tell you that the journalists I've spoken to in this country tell us that they feel intimidated and that they are exerting a lot of self-censorship because of the fear that there could be reprisals, that libel laws, that their radio stations could be closed down. This has happened all over the country.
I'm sure I've spoken to at least 5 times more journalists than you have, and what they told me is that the private media exercises censorship. I have a lot of friends who are journalists, and they all tell me that the owners of media decide who they should or should not interview based on their political leanings. I remember perfectly. We were part of the Socialist Party, and they could tell me they could not interview us, and they could only have negative references. So you see, censorship, slander comes from some of the private media. And you see, before we arrived, this form of slander was allowed. Governments before us had to bow in front of journalists even if they were being mistreated, even if they were being treated as corrupt when they were not, or they would wound their honor. Politicians were afraid of the media and had to bow. And if they didn't, they would become targets of media attacks, and the minister or the president would lose their job. The difference is that we confront them. We confront all the lies, all the diatribes, and they don't like that. So it's normal that the journalists who continue with this game, and the owners of the media, and the networks, and the papers that do so feel uncomfortable and feel pressure. And I want to ask you something. Today, tomorrow, or yesterday, check what the media says, the amount of offenses they throw against the President of the Republic, the caricatures. They are horrible. And then they say they don't have freedom to express themselves. Imagine if they did have it. All the editorial pages are filled with poison against the government. I don't understand how anybody can say they are afraid to speak when there is nobody in this country. There is not one journalist in prison, and nobody who is detained for expressing their thoughts. Furthermore, the president or public officials pardoned those that should be in prison, those who were sentenced by the judges.
All right, but can you look at me and tell me honestly that if Julian Assange were an Ecuadorian and he had leaked documents from your foreign ministry or from your armed forces, that he wouldn't be in a prison right now?
Absolutely not.
Really?
There is no reason why he should be behind bars. If he just exercised his freedom of expression and didn't break any law, there is no reason for him to be in prison.
You wouldn't consider that he had committed treason if he had filtered information that you considered sensitive and secretive?
Yes, but this would pertain to the letter of the law. So in this case, I can't tell you that this would happen.
All right, well, let's return again to the Assange affair and how it occurred. Before the talks actually broke down, what was discussed? Were you talking personally, for example, to William Hague?
I didn't speak directly with any British official, with nobody, not even the person in charge of the UK affairs here. This is something the Deputy Minister and the Sub-Secretary for North America and Europe were doing. But of course, I was following the conversations as they transpired. I also thought it wasn't advisable to carry out these conversations at the highest level. Basically, in these conversations, Ecuador was raising the issue of obtaining guarantees for Mr. Assange. We wanted to make sure he would not be extradited to another country if he were to go to Sweden, because that was the fear he had. That's what he told us. He'd tell us, I'm at the center of a political persecution. They are trying to put me on trial in the US, and they will accuse me of violating secrets, of treason, or whatever. So the entire conversation we had with the UK was with the goal of obtaining a guarantee that Mr. Assange would not be sent to another country if he were to go to Sweden. Unfortunately, the threat of attacking our offices cut off the dialogue.
Well, you mentioned Sweden. As you probably are very aware, not just the Swedish government, but ordinary Swedish people are very offended and, in fact, upset because of it is a country that has a long tradition of respecting human rights, defending human rights, especially in Latin America. So I ask you, what evidence do you have that Sweden really was planning from behind the scenes to send Mr. Assange to the United States?
Bueno, hay que decir algo. Nosotros no nos hemos...
Well, there is something I need to say. We didn't comment on the Swedish judicial system. Maybe other institutions or other people or the Swedish people know how well the system defends human rights, how well it does it. This is an issue we didn't get into. What was pretty clear to us, though, is that the Swedish public prosecutor in the case of Mr. Assange has acted in a discriminatory way, unlike in other cases that we are aware of. In March, the Swedish prosecutor flew to another country to interview a Swedish citizen who was accused of murder. Assange's lawyers were asking that they do the same with their client, but they didn't want to. The Ecuadorian government offered our facilities so that they could question him in our embassy or via teleconference so that the trial could start. It's important to say that there is no open judicial process against Mr. Assange. This also had a role in our decision. In Ecuador and in Latin America, and in general, nobody would even think of extraditing somebody who has not already been indicted. We can extradite once a trial is over and an imprisonment request has been submitted. That's not what's happening there. They are asking the UK to extradite a person for questioning before a trial has started. It's important to clarify this because I've seen reports suggesting that Mr. Assange has an arrest warrant for crimes committed in Sweden. No, there is no trial underway, and this is a fundamental element of our decision because there is no trial against him.
What upset you most, the treatment towards Assange or the threat to the sovereignty of your embassy in London?
Entonces, el hecho de que el señor Assange...
The fact that Mr. Assange had asked for diplomatic asylum was being analyzed without any irritation between us. We were not upset because Mr. Assange was being persecuted or because he might be extradited. That was simply information for us. What did upset us tremendously was this intolerable, unacceptable, vulgar threat from the United Kingdom. That did bother us. The rest was just a normal diplomatic procedure, and there was no reason for that to bother us. As for the other issue, yes, and it is very possible that the president decided to make his decision about granting asylum sooner as a result of this threat because there was no longer a reason to keep talking. In fact, another video conference had been scheduled with the United Kingdom, not with me, but with other members of our foreign ministry for the day after the threat was received. It was cancelled after what happened.
So are you saying that if you had not received this threat from Great Britain, perhaps the decision would have been different, that you might not have granted asylum to Julian Assange?
If the guarantees that were offered by the United Kingdom and Sweden had been enough and acceptable for Mr. Assange as well, because we were also talking to him and he was already under our protection, perhaps we would not have granted him asylum if we had a guarantee that he would not be extradited to the US. But when we received that threat, there was no longer any possibility to continue our dialogue, and it became indispensable to make a decision.
So what are the options now? I mean, some have even suggested that Ecuador might give diplomatic status to Mr. Assange to allow him to leave the embassy with immunity. Is that feasible?
Bueno, en primer lugar, nosotros tenemos que buscar los caminos.
In the first place, we have to find the most reasonable mechanisms to maintain the best relations possible with the United Kingdom. So the first thing would be to insist on the possibility of them granting Assange safe passage. We would continue our dialogue with them, letting them see that international legislation and Latin American tradition permit this. International legislation supports the concept of granting protection to people who are being persecuted or who are at risk of being killed. In other words, we will continue talking after they put aside their threats to try to obtain safe passage. But there is a second option, which of course Mr. Assange would have to agree to find acceptable. And these are offering him guarantees that until now he has not received. And the other alternative, which we hope we would not have to resort to, is to take our demands before the International Court of Justice in The Hague to demand that the United Kingdom grant safe passage.
But a safe conduct pass or safe passage is a political decision. It is not an obligation of a government.
Bueno, a través de una conversación, a través del diálogo se puede llegar a esos acuerdos.
Through talking, through dialogue, these agreements can be reached. Of course, as you say, it is a political decision on the part of the British government, and we can talk in order to reach agreement. The UK will understand the humanitarian need to do it or not. So, on the dialogue front, that is what we can do. The decision is not in my hands or theirs, but rather in the courts. The court will have to decide if it can ask or demand that the United Kingdom grant safe passage, and if not, we will have to get used to living with Mr. Assange inside our embassy, which we hope will not be the case, because we don't want him to suffer under a situation like this. Living inside an office must be very uncomfortable. He's already been there for 2 months. Hopefully it won't turn into years. We hope the United Kingdom understands, be it for political reasons, for humanitarian reasons, for reasons of solidarity, that it is not advisable to have a person who should be free locked up in an embassy. These are the principles which we assume govern our Western civilization, which is the right to develop in freedom.
What would happen if Mr. Assange were allowed to come here to Ecuador? Would he be allowed to continue his work in Wikileaks?
Por supuesto que sí, claro. Eso es lo que él ha
Of course he would. That's what he asked for when he requested asylum. He was asked why in Ecuador, and he answered because Ecuador respects freedom of expression. Because in Ecuador, he said, I'm sure I'll be able to continue doing what I like, my journalistic work, my search for information, and I'll be able to spread this information to the world. And I know I'll be able to do that in Ecuador, he said. And of course, he will be able to.
Whether it was your intention or not, Ecuador is now being seen as thumbing its nose at powerful nations like the United States and Great Britain. In fact, the U.S. State Department has just said that you're putting on a sideshow. Are you afraid of retaliation?
Look, I will not respond to this vulgarity from the State Department. I don't know if it's exactly what they said, but if it is, it's a vulgarity that deserves no answer. What's happened here is that Ecuador has recovered its dignity at an international level. Unfortunately, previous governments in Ecuador did what the US or Europe told them to do. Even worse, sometimes they made decisions based on what they imagined the US or Europe wanted. Ecuador didn't have any relationship with other countries. We didn't even have real, strong, true relationships with our South American neighbors. Imagine it was even less in the case of Asia, Africa, or the Middle East. That was because Ecuador's diplomacy thought that these relationships would bother the northern countries. What happened since 2007, since Rafael Correa has been president of the Ecuadorians, is that we started thinking with our own head, and we walk on our own feet. We have dignity and sovereignty. If some think this is just a show, so be it. We're just exercising our right to forge international relationships based on our own will according to the decisions that we make. And if somebody thinks that this is just a sideshow, they should go to the circus.
Mr. Foreign Minister, thank you so much for talking to Al Jazeera. Thank you for being with us.
See you.